Hi, and thank you for joining us for this episode of the State of Leadership, Simple and Beyond. That is Robert Hilliard. I am Whitney Wiley with an open mic now. And we want to thank you for joining us this week. And we are here on Thursdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Pacific, talking all things leadership. And today we are back with another children's story, a fable. And it's a good one, right? There are lots of lessons to be learned in the story. We'll be talking about the tortoise and the hare. I will give a brief summary of the story in just a second. And Robert, the way I thought we would handle this today is I'll let you lay out your leadership lessons. I will jump in where we are in alignment. And then when you are done, if I have anything left to add, I will add it then. How's that
Okay,
work for you?
that works for
Cool,
me.
cool. So, um, an opening question. Have you ever underestimated someone, including yourself, because the pace didn't look impressive, right? I spent the last couple of days with new managers and leaders, and we talk about the shoulds, right? The should haves, and it should go this way, it should be faster, it should be right. And when we do that, we're really underestimating people, thinking it should happen in a particular way. And the fact of the matter is that it is less about the pace than our intentionality and the purpose behind what we are doing. And so we'll get into some of that. And we live in a world that rewards speed, right? Getting things done fast. And sometimes fast is good, sometimes fast is slow, and slow is smooth, and smooth gets you to the finish line. And that's what we're going to be talking about, right? Ultimately, it's about getting to the finish line, and whether it's fast or slow, right? It's about really about the intention behind it. So we're going to look at some of the lessons that come from this. We invite you to join us and share lessons that you have, where whether you agree with us or you have others, feel free to drop them in the comments.
Mhm.
So let's get this party started. Robert, where are you seeing leadership lessons in? Oh, I need to share a summary of the story, right?
Yeah.
Before we dive into that a little bit. If it's been a while since you have read the story, right? Just want to provide a simple overview. So there's a speedy and confident hare, a rabbit, and a tortoise, which, if you know anything about turtles and tortoises, they move rather slowly. And the hare challenges the tortoise to a race. And midway through the race, convinced that he's going to win because he's so far ahead, this confident and maybe overly confident hare decides to take a nap. Now, I can say this, I agree with him on taking naps, but I don't know if it's a good thing to do it in the middle of a race. And so while he's napping, the tortoise just keeps going, moving, moving, moving. And in the end, the tortoise crosses the finish line first, proving that consistent effort outpaces arrogance and, I would say, unpredictability. So that's how I'm summarizing it. I threw a little bit of commentary in there, just for fun, but there you have it. So, where are your lessons in this, Robert?
Before I talk about my lessons, I want to talk about what I think is very interesting. When we think about this fable, the thing that usually comes to mind is slow and steady wins the race, right? That's the
Yeah,
first thing.
yep.
Yeah. But there's a lot of other leadership lessons, or lessons, not just lead, but lessons that could be learned from this. And I think it's very interesting that that's what everyone's focused on when there are a lot of other things. So I read a different version of this because it's been a while since I was in kindergarten, at least a couple of years. And so I hadn't read this story, I wanted to make sure I remembered all this. So I reread the story. And what I think is interesting is when I did it, a lot of other lessons popped out. So first of all, consistent effort and a steady pace leads to impactful results. If you're consistent and you just work at a steady pace, it can have a lot more impact than if you work in fits and starts, which is what a lot of people do, right? A lot of businesses sometimes, or leaders, they have like really good ideas, and then they really want to inspire their people, and then they don't do it for months or weeks on end, and then they wonder why people are not inspired. Then they go back and they try to rally up people, and so I think that's very interesting. That was the first thing that jumped out to me. The second lesson is past success does not guarantee future wins. So in the story, the Hare is so focused on the fact that he's been successful being fast. And in the story I read, there was more than one character in the story that I read, the version that I read. They broke it down to the Hare, the tortoise, and the general public, they said. So the general public were wishing bad things would happen to the Hare, like he would fall, run off into off the land and get eaten by a crocodile. They mentioned that several times in the story that I read. So
what are you reading, a Grimm's version of this?
no,
I don't know. Don't know this version of the story.
This woman had, I think there were reworkings of the old Aesop's fables, but that was one thing. So they were like, what, they were really annoyed with the Hare. And they were like, most people didn't want the Hare to succeed. So past success does not guarantee future wins. So you need to really be looking at what's going on around you, learn the lessons from your past success, but don't successes, but don't rely on them, because they're not necessarily going to help you. They have that saying, what got you here won't get you there. You've heard that.
Right.
The other lesson that I thought was like resilience and determination help you achieve goals. So that was the tortoise. The tortoise was like, what? This guy's fast, but I know. And the reason why the tortoise accepted the challenge was because he knew that the Hare was all over the place. So he's like, what? Gladly accept your challenge, and start marching off at his very, slow but steady pace. Which is funny because completely off topic kind of is, I kept getting the Bugs Bunny cartoon version of this in my head. I don't know if you remember that, but that kept jumping in my head. So the other leadership lesson I have is about focus. The tortoise was extremely focused, stayed focused. The Hare was scatterbrained. The Hare was like, I have all this ability. I don't need to stay focused. I can go and do this or that, or take a nap. I don't need to stay focused at all. But the tortoise was very focused and kept marching at its steady pace. The other thing that jumped out to me is more of a strategy thing. Know your competition. The tortoise knew his or her competition, I want to be fair, right? Knew their competition, knew that the Hare was not very reliable, was kind of scatterbrained, was relying on one particular skill that they were very good at, but didn't really apply effectively. So really know your competition. And the last one is don't get complacent. The Hare was very complacent. Tortoise, not so much. Or not at all, I should say.
I love that. I love that. So I would say where we had some alignment, and I don't disagree with you on the other ones, but the lessons that I had, and I had three. I pulled three. I could have pulled more, but I pulled three. Consistency, definitely a focus on that. And I also thought about it in terms of our leadership framework. Simple, right?
Yeah.
Self-awareness, intentionality, mastery, purposeful resourcefulness, leverage, and energy, and in particular, mastery and intentionality in this concept of being consistent. And so there are a number of things that came to me, right? There's talent, sort of what we start with as leaders, right? Maybe it's those aspects that we have that come naturally for us. But it could also be those things that we develop, but that starting point of talent and the skills and ability that they give you an advantage in the beginning, but it's consistency, as you said, right, that gets you, that keeps you in the game and gets you to the finish line ultimately. And the Hare in this instance was relying on his or her natural ability, right, that he or she was fast. And there's the Hare, took for granted that he was faster. And I'm going to go with he. That the Hare was faster. But somewhere along the line, being so dependent on that and thinking, well, I've got this in the bag, I don't have to really follow through, right? I'm not exactly sure what he thought the tortoise was going to do, that the tortoise would stop and take a nap, or was just so slow that would never get to the finish line. Something else that came to me, and again, you said both leadership lessons, life lessons, and I agree that those are both present, which is why children's stories, the fables, are such good learning tools. Right. In leadership, consistency is also what builds the currency that allows us to have relationships with the people that we're leading, right? Credibility, trust, and results. And again, over the last couple of days, I've been training these new leaders, and we talked about this concept of being consistent, because when you are consistent, people can rely on you. They can trust you. They know that you will be there for them, for the team, the department, the organization. And when we're not consistent, right, people don't know what to expect. And when they don't know what to expect, it makes it difficult for them to trust us, and it damages our credibility. And credibility is a currency that's really important in leadership. And you talked about being erratic, right? Leaders who are erratic, even if they're brilliant, can lose the team's trust and alignment with the goals and the values that they profess to have. So it becomes vitally important to be consistent. And so here's the really interesting thing, right? The Hare could have won the race and then took a nap.
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah, could have.
Right?
You're so fast. You could beat the tortoise. You could just cross the finish line and keep going right home.
Or take a nap at the finish line and be there when the tortoise passed the finish line. It's like, oh yeah, I've been asleep for 2 days or whatever it is. But right, it's that arrogance, that ego piece that creates created his problem. And it's often a something that creates problems for leaders. And so taking a step back and saying, okay, so I've mastered this skill. In the case of the Hare, mastered being fast. But are you intentional about what you're doing? Right now, you have a goal, which is to win this race. Being intentional about that, and focusing, and that was one of your lessons, right? And focusing on the outcome that you're pursuing, right? And not getting distracted. And that's what the nap was, right? It was a distraction from the ultimate goal, and his not choosing to be intentional about what he was doing created the problem and ultimately the loss.
Yeah, there's also, I mean, in that there's a lot of other hidden things there. Delayed gratification, right? They say that people that can delay gratification are more successful than those that need to have the latest thing or can't put things off. And so it's really interesting that we're looking at this with a more, of course, adult leadership lens, because when you're a kid, a lot of these things, they're just lost on you. What's delayed gratification? I want this now, and you're pretty much, not all the time, but you're used to getting things now. You haven't developed that sense of maturity that lets you go, okay, let me wait a little bit. I remember one of the probably most important lessons in my life was when I was just starting out as a musician, or wasn't even on the journey yet. I was at that consciously incompetent. Like, I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't know how to do it. And I didn't even have an instrument. And I, went to my mother and said, I want this instrument. And she said, I can't afford it. And then she said, well, how are you going to get it? And I said, I don't know. She goes, well, think of some jobs you can do in the neighborhood. And, you can cut lawns, maybe you can babysit, whatever it was. And I was like, okay. And so I started doing these things. And because I did those things, I still play to this day, as opposed to a lot of people who are used to, well, I want this, guitar, or I want this set of drums, and their parents go, okay, and gives it to them. And it's just a fad that the child's into. There's no discipline, but because it's called the IKEA effect, right? When you work to create something, you have pride in it. But because I worked hard to buy that instrument, I stuck with it. And we sometimes lose those lessons, and those are really good lessons to teach children. And I to this day, it's probably one of the most important lessons that I learned when I was growing up.
I agree wholeheartedly. And you just said something that occurred to me as well about discipline and being disciplined. And ultimately, the tortoise won not because he was extraordinary,
You mean the
but
toy? Yeah, yeah,
the tortoise won, right?
yeah, yeah, right.
Because not because he was extraordinary, but
Yeah,
by being disciplined, right?
yeah, he was disciplined. Yeah,
And so that consistency, discipline, and often when we think of discipline, I don't know if we've talked about this before, but people often go to punishment, and that is one form of discipline, but another is making a commitment to something and then sticking it through, right? Being consistent, taking the steps and the actions necessary to get you to the goal that you um, are pursuing. And being a musician and a competent and a good musician is definitely one of those areas where discipline pays off, right? And it doesn't take a lot. Again, it's not about being extraordinary. You can become extraordinary through your discipline. You'll have to start there. And I think that's what trips some people up sometimes. It's like, well, I'm not special, I'm not this. It's like, no, you master this by being disciplined.
yeah. Two things when you said you're really hitting all those places in my brain that's tripping all these memories. And I remember one of my teachers telling me one time, he said, the only thing that separates you and me is discipline and time. That's he said that's the magic formula. He goes, it's discipline and time. That's the only thing. So the more discipline you have, and the more time you put in, the better you're
Yeah.
going to be. And there was another lesson that popped up, and I'm sure it'll come back to me, but that one really stood out to me, was like the whole discipline and time thing, really just being focused. And it's, and this is really funny because we can equate it to anything. um, it's not the amount of years you do something, but it's the amount of hours you do. We talk about this all the time. You can be interested in something, whether it's leadership, you can be interested in management, you can be interested in strategy, you can be interested in motivation, how to motivate people. You could be interested in those things for many years
Mhm.
and still be at the same place. But if you are interested in those things and you're putting in the hours to learn those things and you're practicing and you're experimenting with those things, you will become masterful over time. But sometimes we forget that. And I remember, these are all, since we're talking about music, I remember one time we were playing with somebody, jamming with somebody, and they weren't very good. And a friend of mine said, well, this person's been playing for, X amount of years. And, somebody else said, but how many hours if they practice within those years? That's what really matters. It's not the number of years. So with anything, and leadership requires practice. It requires some study. It requires you to go out and talk to people and work with your group and seeing what works, what motivates them, seeing what their values are, and helping them connect those to their work. And in that you can engage in one of our principles, which is mastery, is learning how to be masterful in doing that. And it's really important.
I love that. You want to get into, so your second point was past successes. You want to touch on that a little more, because you had other things that you brought up, and I can just jump
Yeah,
in to
sure.
those
Let's talk
areas.
about those. So yeah, past successes. A lot of times we rest on our laurels, right? So we have a past success or something we think we're good at, and we may be. We may be very good at this thing, but if we're not continually working at it, there's two aspects of this. Continually working at, other people will eventually catch us and surpass us. That's one thing. So you have to be continually working on those things. And the other thing is, your past successes should not make you complacent to the point that you're not looking, any further than where you are right now. So I think those are the two most salient points that I had in my mind when it came to that.
It is a good point, and it's not something that I had thought about. So I'm glad you brought that up, because we're often, and I think you brought out a nuance in this. It is not the past successes guarantee future wins or outcomes, right? It certainly can be an indicator, because it tells us that it, assuming you've learned lessons and you apply what you've learned, right, that you're more likely to get where you're going, because you've been there, you've tried something before, rather than thinking just because I've won in the past means I'm necessarily going to win in the future. And I think that's a good nuance and something to keep in mind. And you mentioned this in your opening, is that the Hare, right, was, yeah, well, I've won before, I'm fast, this has happened in the past, therefore it fed into the ego. And a little later on I'll get a little more into that aspect, and how what ego does to us and how it gets in the way. And so I just appreciate you bringing this point up, because it wasn't one that I actually had considered.
Well, I wanted to point something else out too, because as you were talking, some other things jumped into my head. Think about all of these organizations and companies that were staples in our lives 20 years ago, who had a ton of success. Sears, J.C. Penney, they had huge success. And you couldn't, when I was growing up, they were always talking. They always had commercials on TV. That's a place where if something broke in your house, you went to Sears, because they had appliances, they had tools, they were highly respected, and they had been around for decades. But great success didn't necessarily shift with the times. I remember years ago, J.C. Penney, they tried to upgrade their look. They tried to do that. But what they didn't do was I don't think they really engaged in any true focus groups with their people, because they didn't realize the demographics. And so they shifted the JCP. I believe they're still known by that now.
They're known by JCP now, right?
JCP now. But they tried to do that way earlier. This was like way earlier in the early 2000s, and it was a complete flop. They got rid of the coupons. No, people did not want that. They tried to go to something called everyday savings, and people wanted to see what they were physically getting with those coupons. As absurd as that may seem, but they just weren't doing that. So, I think they're doing a little better, but they're still not the household name that they were.
Right.
Back
Right.
in the day, they were huge. Sears, huge. And we're going to start to see this. I'm going to make some pretty soft predictions now. We're going to start to see this with some of the staple companies that we see, today. They're going to start falling away too, because you can't rely on your past success and think that that's going to carry you for decades. Things are moving way too fast now.
Absolutely. And we talked about this before, right? We talked about Blockbuster and Kodak and um, uh, I think Polaroid finally made a little shift. It has a new camera and how, adapting to how people use cameras and video and how they share them, right? So it's about adaptation and growth, and you cannot rely on your past successes. You can leverage your past successes. You can learn lessons and then leverage them, but you've got to be adaptable and willing to change in order to put them into play as things, life, the environments, and the external challenges that you have continue to change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nice. The next one was around focus.
I think it was, we did resilience and determination was before focus, right?
I had past successes, focus, strategy,
Okay, yeah, that we go with
complacency.
focus.
So,
Focus, we can do that. Focus is, I think probably the one true talent that I have is the fact that if I like something, I can focus on it. And maybe it's not, maybe it's a detriment to the exclusion of all other things, right? And so focus is really important when you're trying to achieve something. I think that is one of the things that we sometimes forget, because we live in a world where things are coming at us, and it's very easy to get distracted now. We have these things are all, everybody has them. We have notifications on them, alerts, and so it's easy to get distracted. I'm talking about individually. As a leader, you can be distracted by many things, right? So we sometimes forget that leaders have personal lives. So when they come into the job, they can be distracted with the other stuff that's going on
yeah,
in the background of their lives, or they can be distracted with fads. There's some leaders that, I had a boss that it seemed like every new fad that came up, they wanted us to get involved in that. You should do a training on this. And then the next week it was, stop that. We should do a training on this thing. And I was like, well, why don't we, get people together and do a survey and find out what they feel will have the biggest impact, instead of grabbing the what's the flavor of the month training or development thing and do. But that's a real danger of not being focused. It's easy to be distracted
yeah,
by the shiny new thing that's coming up. But on the other hand, you have to balance that with some, hey, look, I see everybody is really getting into this thing. How can we use that? I have some clients that are looking into ways they could use AI in their business to, when it comes to like answering some very easy questions that customers may
okay,
have. And so that, that's legitimate. It's not a flavor of the month type of thing. It's here to stay. But there have been other fads that have come and gone that people latch on to, and then then when it's over, they're, you know, 2 or 3 steps behind because they were focusing on this thing that had no substance.
no, I hear you, and I had focus on my list of three as well, and so the importance of focus and tying it to energy and leverage, going back to the simple leadership framework, right? Here's some of the things that stood out to me, and um, the, we talked about consistency, right? And in the end, I absolutely agree with you. It wasn't about the slowness of the tortoise, it was about that consistency, right? But whether it's slow or consistent, there's something about taking some time, and it's relative, right? The amount of time. And so it's not that you need to take days or weeks or even hours. It depends on the situation, whatever the situation is. But for a slow leader, and I'm using air quotes for slow leader, to be deliberate in making moves, to be more strategic so that you waste less time, right? So that you are efficient with what you're doing and you're not wasting time, energy, or resources. And so there is some wisdom occasionally in that, this sort of new paradigm that we're in is move fast and break stuff, and that's fine. But there are times when you need to be more strategic and deliberate, and you don't want to waste time, and you need the energy, etc., and you need to spend some time thinking about what that looks like, right? So the tortoise wasn't fast, but the bottom line was that he never stopped, and so
Mhm.
that focus, that his energy was sustainable. Whereas, and you mentioned this in some capacity earlier, where the hare burned hot and fast,
Mhm.
right, and then crashed. And so think of that in the terms of burnout, and how many leaders and team members we have that are burnt out or distracted by all the things that are bombarding them, and you feel like you're overwhelmed and you don't have the capacity to take on anything else or to sort of keep going. And it's difficult to leverage all the things at your disposal if you're not focused on what it is you're doing and where it is you're going. And so having that focused energy ultimately means knowing where and how to apply yourself, right? That leverage piece. How do you leverage what you had at your disposal, the resources that you have at your disposal, the team members, the knowledge, the skill set, etc., and you don't want to waste those things by using them in different ways, or getting distracted and going off track, and not looking to use them in any way whatsoever. And so the tortoise wasn't multitasking, right? Didn't get distracted, and wasn't looking for some way to, you know um wasn't looking for a way to, let's say, hack the system or something, right? It wasn't looking for some trick. It was just saying, this is, this is what I do. Da-da-da-da.
Keep going.
I'm just gonna keep going. I'm gonna stay in my lane, and if I do this, eventually I get to the finish line. And that's ultimately what I believe leverage in leadership is about. It's not about doing more, it's about doing what matters and leveraging what you have. And knowing your strengths and weaknesses, right? So that you can leverage what you have in order to get where you're going.
You need to know your resources, and I think a lot of times we don't really think about that. We forget it, um, or really don't put enough thought into how we're going to use those resources. And there's a lot of things that get in the way of that, and that's for another episode. But it's really important to focus, have a firm target, and stay laser locked on that. And you mentioned multitasking. There's a time and a place to multitask. Everything, one of the things that I love about the conversations that we have is we're advocates of nearly everything, right? There's a time and a place for that stuff, but not all the time. And I think that if you move fast and break stuff, if that's your mantra in life, you're going to have some problems. You may have some success, but you're going to have some problems too, because you need to balance it out with some steady focus. There's a time to move fast and break stuff. I'm about that when it needs to happen. But I think that sometimes because a lot of people, not everybody, I should say there are some people that get really annoyed when you take too much time. I know when I work with younger people, whether it's in martial arts or music, they get really frustrated when they see other people doing things that they can't do. When am I going to learn that? I'm like, well, the thing you're doing right now is not very good, right? You'll learn that when you get this good, right? Don't worry about that other thing, right? Worry about doing this excellently, and you'll get everything else that follows. But we live in a world now where it's so easy to get stuff. You can go on YouTube and you can get a lot of really good knowledge about things really quickly. And I think what people forget is, although you can get that stuff and a lot of it is valid and a lot of it is good, you'll be missing some foundational steps in between there. So you can learn nearly anything on YouTube. There are some really good instructors there in different disciplines, but you need a foundation, right? And so we live in this world where we can get a lot of information really quickly, and sometimes we forget that in order to progress, like you said earlier, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. We need to move slowly at first, and then you can build up that speed and you'll be able to learn other things really quickly.
Yeah, and knowledge and information doesn't make you skilled and get you where you're going. It's just knowledge and information. It has to be applied, and the foundation that you're talking about. So it's the application of what you learned. Is not just that you've heard something or even learned something. It's the application of what you've learned that allows you to develop wisdom and to use those lessons in a way that move you forward. And I love your example about how come I'm not doing that. Well, it's not time.
Well, you don't
Right?
have you don't have the
You don't have,
capability to
you
do it
don't
now.
have the capability to do it because it's not your time. You haven't built the foundation. You haven't built the expertise of where you are. And that's why lessons are laid out the way they're laid out. It's so that you can build upon them. I studied mathematics, right? You think about mathematics, and the journey that I went on. You start by learning to count, and then you learn to add, and then you learn to subtract, and then you learn to multiply, divide, which is sort of addition and subtraction, on a little bit of steroids. Then you learn how to do exponents and imaginary numbers and this and that. And then there's geometry and calculus and trigonometry, right? And everything builds. So if you don't have the foundation, the basics of arithmetic, it's difficult for you to get to higher and higher levels of math, which is why I think a lot of people don't like math, is because they didn't get good, strong foundation. Because math is everything and it's everywhere around us. It's in music, right? It's in in computers and the technology that we use. It's the foundation and basis for so much, the engineering that builds things, and so it's there for us. It's in nature, and it's there for us to appreciate. But if we don't have a strong foundation, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, one, to really appreciate it, but more importantly, to apply it in other areas of our lives. And going to the point about we're in a fast food society, we're in a society where, some people have made it possible for technology to make our lives easier, and that's great. But it's easy to the point that we don't have the basic skills that if something were to break down, we cannot troubleshoot and problem solve so that we can move forward, right? So we're constantly having to look to other people to do that. And we are less and less having that ability ourselves to do it.
Well, I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of, we can go off on all kinds of tangents here with this because it's a basic lesson that's rich with a lot of context. And one of the things that I think is really funny and interesting to me is how we've kind of, I want to say this in a proper way, we've kind of gotten the younger generation accustomed to things being easy, very easy. And I totally get why you want to do that. But on the other hand, I think when you do that, you lose other things. And I think that sometimes we make, and I'm talking about society as a whole, we make decisions that we think that are going to advance us without doing a whole lot of due diligence and a whole lot of research and going slow to go fast. For example, they got rid of cursive writing a while ago, and now they're going back to it in some places. And I'm like, well, they realized that they were missing something. And I remember it was really interesting. Well, a lot of historical documents are written in cursive, right? And no one. I gave some gifts to some children years ago, and I wrote them a note from Santa in cursive. And the kids got it, and they go, I don't. What does it say? It was like a foreign language to them, right? So I know you're shaking your head, but it's one of those things. And then the other hand, on my end of it, I took for granted. So this is my blind spot. I took for granted that I always want to balance it out that they would know that. So there's a generational thing there as well. But you have to really think about the long range, and you hear I'm going to throw systems in it, systemic, the long range implications of whatever change you're going to make. And so now there are some people that are going back. Some states, I believe, they're going back to teaching cursive because they realized that it was really important to this. But it's you have to do your due diligence with these things, and I think that's really it's a part of focus, right? Not being distracted by the show. Everyone else is doing this. We're going to do this too. We talked about that. But it's also about what you mentioned earlier when you tied it into simple. It's about some self-awareness too. It's being aware, not only of yourself, but your environment. We're always talking about that on the show. You got to know what's really going on here. And when I mentioned YouTube before, there is a lot of great information on the great knowledge, and people share their knowledge on YouTube, but there's also a lot of disinformation.
Yes.
And stuff on there. And I have a colleague that gets, I'm not trying to disparage anything. They get most of their news and things from YouTube, and a lot of stuff that they say to me I easily debunk it because that's not true. This is what happened because YouTube has that algorithm in there. And if you start looking at certain things, it starts feeding you those things that you're looking at. So if you look at a lot of misinformation, it's going to feed you a whole lot of misinformation because the algorithm is going to say that's what this person likes. So you have to be really careful about the information you're getting because you can get a lot of information really fast, but it's not always very good information, which is why one of the most important lessons we learned when we went to school was that you got to look at your sources. You got to you look and verify those sources, and you get multiple sources, and you have a better chance of being correct when you make your hypothesis or your thesis, rather than just grabbing one thing and saying, okay, this is the one.
That is so very true. So your next one was strategy of knowing your competition.
Knowing your competition, yeah. a lot of times when we have a business, right? And I'm not saying that we need to be, cutthroat, that red ocean strategy. We're not talking about that. But really, when you put a strategy together, you're putting a strategy together so you can have a competitive advantage, right? You need to know what you're capable of, what your resources are, what you have at your disposal, but you also need to know what other people are capable of and what they are doing, right? Um, this is why in sports they look at film, right? It's not film anymore, but they look at, you know, video of other teams. They want to know what the other players tendencies are, what the coach's tendencies are, the kinds of plays that coach is going to call out. You need to know these things. When it comes to your business, I talked about market signals. How does your competition respond to market signals, those things that come out in your industry that may be a signal that things are going to change? How does your competition handle those things? Are they switching over to something that is not going to be sustainable? You shouldn't just switch over. You need to do your due diligence as well. So it's really knowing your competition, because when you're in business, you are competing against other people. I hate to say it, but that's the truth. And not that competition needs to be a bad thing, because competition brings out the best in all of us. But you need to know, what your folks are capable of. I frequently send clients that aren't a good fit for me to people that I quote unquote compete with, because they were better suited to handle that particular issue than I am. So and they do the same with me. They send me people too. So it's one of those things where you need to know what your competition is capable of so you can make the right choices for you and your team.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I included this under I gave it a slightly different category, but I think it's this point. You can you can be capable. You don't need to underestimate others' capability, right? And that piece about knowing your competition. And so this goes to self-awareness and some sense of purpose again. And don't underestimate others and don't overestimate yourself, right? Be clear about who you are, what you're capable of, but that little ego piece that could get in there and make you think that you're more than you are, right, can get in the way and can ruin your strategy. So I put this under a category of humility, and that there is a sense of a lack of humility in particular for the Hare, and that the ego piece that comes into that makes you blind to the risk, blind to what others bring to the table, and creates blind spots for you that you know can keep you from seeing what your competition really is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And then you had complacency.
Yeah. Don't rest on your laurels. Just because you're successful now doesn't mean. Look at Sears and J.C. Penney. I mean, those were two very successful stores. And look, I'm not. Who knows what happened with those the corporations, but they are not the household names that they once were. And I think that I don't know if they were resting on their laurels, or they just got lost with the times, or they didn't make the shift, or they didn't pivot. Like I said, that's an episode for another date. But what got you where you are is not necessarily what's going to sustain you. It can for a little bit of time, but you have to look at the environment and what's shifting out there. We live in a VUCA world. Things are changing all the time, and they're changing faster than they've ever changed before. And we can get caught very quickly if we're complacent and we're not looking to be better, and really sharpen our skills so that we can make those pivots and we can still bring value to people. I think that's the thing. When you stop bringing value to people, that's when they start to shift away from you. You have to continually look at ways that you can bring value. And it's funny because I mentioned those stories, but there's a sense of nostalgia with those stories. Whenever I see a Sears, I'm like, oh man, Sears. When I was a kid, my mom would take me to Sears, and they had a little bit of everything. That was the go-to place. When something in your home or something happened with your car, you took it to Sears because they had everything. And that's another thing. Now things are more specialized than they were before. So who knows what really went wrong with them, but it certainly was.
Maybe we'll do some case studies of some
Yeah.
businesses, defunct businesses. It's interesting because I have a very unfavorable recollection and remembrance
Photos.
of Sears, not around photos. It was around, I wanted a pair of Chuck Taylors, high top.
Okay.
And it was like all the rage. I don't know exactly how old I was, but it was like all the rage. And my parents bought me a pair of black and red high tops from Sears, and I was very unhappy.
They
So
were not Chuck Taylors.
they were not Chuck Taylors, and they were red and black. And so years later, it would have been great, right? Could have attributed it to Michael Jordan and the Bulls or something like that. But at the time, it wasn't a thing. So just that's why they went under, because they ruined my life. They ruined my life. And then your last point before we wrap up was around resiliency.
Yeah, you being resilient, really being able to bounce back from setbacks. They're going to happen, and you can't look at those. There are lessons to learn when you have those setbacks, and it's really about determination, right? So that's the tortoise. That's the tortoise part of it. The tortoise was determined to complete this race, and was determined to be competitive. You have to, if you have determination, it's easier to be resilient, and you'll be able to weather those storms when they come up. But you're always going to have setbacks. I think part of the way the way I'm wired. I don't want to say we. Even though I know I'm going to have setbacks, when I have a strategy or a plan, I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this thing. I do try to have at least two contingencies if things don't go my way. But sometimes, even with those, I'm surprised by the things that do give me problems. So that's where you really have to be determined and resilient, because you can't anticipate everything.
Right.
You can anticipate some things, but there are going to be some surprises. And that's when you dig deep and you get determined and you practice your resilience. You bounce back from being perturbed.
Love that. Any final thoughts?
No, I think this was fun. We got a lot more out of this than I thought we were going to get, to be honest with you. I was like the tortoise and the hare. And to be honest, I suggested this one because I couldn't think of any others. I read some others. I went to some of the Hans Christian Andersen ones, and I was like, yeah, it was a little bit religious.
I have a whole list. We will not run out of things,
Okay,
stories
fine.
to talk about. So I have a whole list, and I enjoyed the conversation. I think it's important that it's relevant. Again, we can look at the experiences that we've had from the time we were children to now. We can look at the stories, the movies, right? The current events that have happened over time. All of them are ripe with lessons, life lessons, leadership lessons, and we're going to be bringing them to you. So I want to leave you with three sort of reflection prompts, if you will, and then I will wrap this up. Are your leadership habits helping you win the long game, right? Are you relying too much on a particular skill, a talent, or charisma, right? It could be something maybe you're relying too much on. Look at your the quiver, right? That's where you keep all your ammo in art in bows and arrows, right? In archery. Are your leadership habits helping you to win the long game? Where is your ego slowing you down? Even when you feel like you're ahead, right? Where are the things that you're holding on to that you think that make you special? Where are they holding you down? What are the blind spots in that? And are you pacing yourself towards something meaningful or burning energy on proving how fast you can go? Right? You can go fast. And as Robert said, there's a time to go fast and break things, and there's a time to slow down and be deliberate. And so think about that. Are you burning energy on proving how fast you can go rather than moving towards something meaningful? So,
Absolutely.
with that, we want to thank you for joining us for this episode of the State of Leadership Simple and Beyond. Again, we are here on Thursdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Pacific. We're on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And we would invite you to like, share, subscribe, and join us every week. If you've got a topic you would like for us to cover, please reach out and let us know. If you're interested in being a guest, you can reach out and let us know. We've got guests coming up in the near future, and we would be interested in talking to you about the potential of you joining us as a guest. And Robert, if someone wanted to connect with you so that they could slow down and be smooth
And be deliberate.
and be deliberate, how would they go about doing that?
They can email me at inspireme@roberthilliardcoaching.com, or they can just go to my website, Robert Hilliard Coaching, look for that contact form, fill it out, let me know what goals or challenges, goals you have or challenges you're experiencing, and we can set up a discovery call and just to really just talk and see if we're a good match for each other.
Awesome. And likewise, you can reach out to me at shiftingintooaction.now.site, shiftingintooaction.now.site. Let's connect and see if we're a good match. If not, I'll refer you to Robert or someone else in
Mhm.
my network that would be a better fit for you. So, uh, thank you for joining us. Slow down, right? Be deliberate, be purposeful, intentional, and take care.
Bye now.